I'm here with Professor Sandrine Zufferey. Thank you so much for joining me today. Many students, including myself, get into linguistics because there's some moment of fascination. And now I would really love to know what first sparked your interest in language. Was there like some moment of fascination?
Mm-hmm. So for language or languages, I think it was always there. I knew even when I was in high school I wanted to do something related to languages, but I didn't know of linguistics. So I signed up for a course in translation and interpreting at the University of Geneva. And then I was asked to spend 1 year in each of my foreign languages to improve like every other students. And I ended up at Trinity College Dublin. And that's where I discovered linguistics. And I must say, I think what really sparked my interest was a seminar on language acquisition with Professor David Singleton that was so fascinating and interesting, and I was allowed to conduct my first empirical study, a case study of a child acquiring language, a friend of my parents, and it was so nice to, get my hands on data. After that, I knew that translation wasn't for me and I would move on to linguistics.
So there were some role models along the way that introduced you to linguistics.
Yeah. I think there were several very good professors at Trinity College Dublin, but most of all, I think it's also the way the English-speaking world thinks about linguistics. I'm very sure that if I had discovered linguistics in Linguistic 101 at the University of Neuchâtel, for example, I wouldn't be a linguist now, because the way they do it, Saussure, structuralism, isn't really at all what really interests me. So what was really interesting for me was this empirical, hands-on way to do things that started there, and then I discovered pragmatics, and I was lucky to be mentored by Deirdre Wilson from UCL, one of the co-founders of relevance theory, so she was a big role model for me. And later on I moved on to empirical studies, experiments, and I was lucky enough to go for a postdoc in Ted Sanders' team at the University of Utrecht, and again it was a very, very important collaboration for me. And also, of course, with my PhD supervisor, Jacques Mechelet, who was one of the few linguists in French-speaking Switzerland who was really open to this English-speaking literature and really also introduced me to all these great people.
And were there linguistic phenomena that also drew you towards linguistics, not only people that you met?
Yes, of course. I was always interested in communication. So to me, the structure of language in itself was never that strong an interest, but I was fascinated by what people could do with language. And in that sense, that very small book, How to Do Things with Words by Austen, was really what I felt, what you can do with language. It's amazing. You can declare war, you can get married, you can threaten people, you can interact, you can fall in love. So that was really what I was interested in, communication. And I have to say, for the first years, also the breakdown of communication. So I was really interested in pathologies that prevent people from communicating. So autism in particular was a phenomenon that I was really interested in during my PhD.
Was it then, it sounds like it, was it always linguistics for you? Or were there any subjects you were interested in as well?
Honestly, I never considered doing anything else.
Okay, great. So, has your perspective on language changed since then?
Yes, a lot actually. I was really drawn to psychology at the time, experiments, and there was little place in what I was doing for social phenomena. And this has changed quite radically over the years. I have just started last summer my first qualitative study in sociolinguistics. So now I'm discovering a whole new land of research that I never tried before, interviews, qualitative data analysis. And that's really something that has evolved over the years.
Is there a reason for that?
It's not really that I'm not doing experiments anymore, it's just that I broadened my views and I started getting really interested in all these social issues, also because of all the great colleagues we have here and listening to conferences. And I started also realizing that cognitive and social phenomena are not mutually exclusive, and that you cannot explain all the cognitive phenomena that you're interested in if you really factor out individual differences. So that's one of the key words in my research right now, individual differences between people, the fact that we are wrong to think that, a bit like what Chomsky said, we all have this internal language and everybody's competent in their mother tongue. Yes, to some extent, but there are also huge differences between people. And that's what I'm interested in. And of course, there's a lot of social factors that come along the way, starting with gender.
I had the chance to read one of your articles with the title Individual Differences in the Ability to Master Connectives, the Importance of Exposure to Print from 2022. So before we go into details, could you please quickly explain for our listeners what discourse connectives are?
So discourse connectives are all these little words like but, however, therefore, that we often think of as just part of academic language and unimportant, but that empirical research has shown are crucial to improve the way people understand the logical links between texts, so their overall understanding of a text, also what they remember from a text, and they also guide young readers in their comprehension of the links between sentences. So they are very important, actually. If you remove all connectives from a text, it becomes totally unreadable. And so connectives have been my entry point into communication phenomena since my PhD was already on the acquisition of causal connectives by French-speaking babies and children. So now I'm more interested in the way these are used in written phenomena, because in text they are all over the place in all textual genres, and we realize that all these connectives, there are many connectives that are used only in writing. In speech we say just but and all the time, but in writing we say all these things like however, therefore, that we wouldn't say much using oral language.
And you also say that it has to do with the academic level, right? So how much people read scientific papers, for example.
Yeah, and even before they are able to read scientific papers, even in French-speaking Switzerland, children are separated between different academic levels already at secondary school. I think it's the same throughout Switzerland, but we tested people in Neuchâtel. And even between level 1 and level 2 students, there were already huge differences in their understanding of text containing connectives. And it gets wider throughout high school, and we see that it's not that the less able pupils lag behind but finally get there. These differences remain throughout adulthood. And a fascinating aspect of our results, I think, is that people exposure to print in their first language was a very strong predictor of their ability to master this connective in their second language, as if this global exposure to print is something that people can really transfer, and the more acquainted they are with the written mode, the more at ease they feel, and the more this competence can be transferable across languages.
I myself notice often that when I learn a new language, that it's really hard for me to understand these connectives, and I tend to just skip them when reading, and I don't really get the full meaning of the text. So what did you say to the second language learners how to manage?
They should be taught, and the problem is that the way they're taught right now is inappropriate. People are given a list of connectives with equivalences across languages, and these connectives are tricky because they look similar across languages. So they think, there's however, there's toutefois, and it's the same. And another part of my research, because I come from translation, has precisely been cross-linguistic comparisons, and we can see that there are almost never perfect matches across languages. So one of the difficulties for learners is that they have to unlearn some of the things that they say, this reminds me of this connective in my language, so they use it in a similar way, and it gets them to make mistakes, what we call negative transfer effects.
In your more recent article from 2025, you turned to a different topic, grammatical gender and natural gender. And the article shows that the way gender is expressed in language is closely linked to how people mentally represent people or also non-human entities. So how did you arrive at that position? Can you elaborate on that?
Of course, again, through experiments. And we've done some in French, but colleagues from even from Bern and from German-speaking Switzerland more generally have done similar experiments in German, showing that when you expose people to generic masculine forms, so sometimes it was very simple experiments. You have to read, so it's difficult in English since we don't have this masculine and feminine forms, but the engineers went out of the cafeteria because it was raining. Some of the women were bringing an umbrella. But in French, you can either use the generic masculine form, les ingénieurs, and then you see how people react when they come to women. If les ingénieurs as a masculine is really interpreted generically, then there should be no interpretation problem. But if you think les ingénieurs is a group of men, then when you reach some of the women, like what? And you just have to go back, and your reading is disturbed, your comprehension is lower, and even when people have to judge, is this a possible continuation? Some of them say no. There's a mistake here.
Let's move on to the bigger picture of your research. Do you have like one big overarching question that really guides your work?
I don't think I have just one. But actually, if you ask me for just one big question, it would be how do people use language to communicate? Now, it's of course too big a question for me to address directly, but I think to some extent all of my research is related one way or another to these big questions, the way we use language for communication.
So I'm also curious about your process. How has your approach to research changed over time?
Well, it has. First, I was coming from linguistics at the time, especially in Geneva, where I did my PhD. It was really a Chomskyan way to think about linguistics. So we were encouraged to use our internal language, to think, to draw rules and stuff. And even in pragmatics, so language and communication, it was crazy enough to realize that people made up their own examples. There was no empirical aspect to it. So that's the first thing I felt, and my first departure from my alma mater was thinking, I cannot work like that. And I was one of the first PhD students that, okay, I need empirical data. I cannot do linguistics without empirical data. So I had to train myself. So first it was easy experiments, offline stuff. And then I moved on. During my postdoc, I learned to do eye tracking and, more implicit measures. So I trained in psycholinguistics, and here my approach was really about quantitative analysis, controlling factors as much as possible, and that was already for me a huge move forward. And I was also feeling that I was doing something a bit more scientific, objective than when I heard people in conferences say, I feel that this structure is out, and there was another native speaker say, well, it's not so bad to me. And I was thinking, no, we need to have more objective data. And more recently, I realized, maybe growing older as well, that doing only quantitative research, you miss part of the fine-grained stuff that you want to know by really talking to someone at some length. And maybe it's not generalizable to the whole population, but you get some deeper insights into people's views, thinking, feelings. So now I'm really I'm trying to combine both.
So let's step back for a moment and talk about where linguistics is heading. When you look at what's happening right now in your field, which developments excite you the most? Do you have?
Yeah, so in my field, in psycholinguistics, I think people are starting to realize that we need to have a broader population than just testing first-year students as people taking part in our experiments. That was the way it was. In psychology, people even got credits for taking part in experiments, and they needed to do it in the first year. So all the results that we have basically are based on highly educated young people. And now people start to realize that we are missing a huge amount of data by not including older people with less education, less knowledge of language, and that so individual differences is really something that people, not only me, are starting to take into account.
Thinking ahead, how would you like linguistics to evolve in the next years?
I hope that, so to me, another important keyword is really diversity, not only in language competence, but in the way we go about studying languages. Because so far we've also, many people in many fields, including mine, have gone for the easy solution and tested people in English, in French, in Dutch. We have loads of data about it. But for example, in the field of language acquisition, how about children acquiring non-written languages in all these countries where there aren't people doing research? And now there's also a growing trend of research for people who start thinking, okay, we need these data. We need to also see more diversity in the languages that we study, in the methods that we use. And that's something that, I would really like to see growing.
Looking back and ahead, do you have advice you would give to someone just starting in linguistics today?
I would really say broaden your mind, read as much as you can, try to see everything that's around here. I also try at a slightly later level, young PhD students, go to conferences, look what's out there. So just, broaden your mind. Don't start with very fixed ideas. Try to discover as much as possible, because everything that's out there is potentially fascinating, and you have to keep your options open.
Did anything in this conversation surprise you or make you reflect in a new way?
Well, I don't think a lot about why I do things on a daily basis, so it was interesting, to realize that even though I have the impression that I've touched on a lot of different topics, that in fact my core interests haven't moved so much over the years. So it's been, I feel once I've explored things, I broaden my interests, but it's more like, broadening a field that is always the same. And I hadn't thought about it this way. So thank you for this opportunity of thinking of why I'm doing linguistics and why these topics are important to me.
1, 2,